She drew my head close against her chest, continuing to sigh softly as she held me there. After a short while, I shifted my attention, exchanging positions between my face and my eager hand, and began again on her other side. "Oh my," she murmured, her voice no more than a breath. I was just beginning to wonder what might happen next when, all of a sudden, the bell rang. We both snapped upright on the bench at the same time and looked at one another, startled back into the moment. "That was truly very, very pleasant," she murmured softly. I noticed a change in her eyes then. The familiar sparkle was still there, but it was joined by something deeper, something more intense. At the time, I didn't recognize it for what it was, only later did I understand that it was desire. "It really was my pleasure," I replied as she quickly fastened her bra again and pulled the jersey back over her head. "I'll see you later or tomorrow, all right?" It sounded more like an instruction than a question. I nodded eagerly, my head bobbing up and down as a wide smile spread across my face. It suddenly occurred to me that I had no idea what her name was. "What's your name?" I asked quickly. She turned to look at me and shook her head from side to side, smiling like the proverbial cat that had just enjoyed a private victory. Whatever her name was, I clearly wasn't going to find it out at that moment. We made our way back toward the picnic table and then inside the building, unseen by anyone along the way. Once indoors, we split off in different directions, each heading to our next class. Mine was English, located on the second floor. The teacher's name was Ms. Someone or other, and before I even reached the classroom, my imagination had already supplied a vivid picture. An unpleasant, elderly woman droning endlessly about punctuation rules and grammar. Whether that image would prove accurate remained to be seen. As I reached the classroom door, I slowly turned the knob and eased it open. A female voice immediately addressed me. "I don't tolerate students who arrive late," she said firmly, "but I'll allow this one exception since it's the first day of school." I already had my head lowered as I walked into the room, hoping the teacher would see that I knew I was late and likely in trouble. I began, slowly lifting my eyes to look at her. I gulped and then stammered, "Really, really sorry, Ms." For the life of me, I simply could not remember her name. What I would remember most clearly was that she was a striking young woman who looked as though she had stepped straight out of a glossy fashion magazine and into the classroom. Her golden hair flowed freely, gathered loosely into a ponytail that rested down her back. She wore a fitted red turtleneck sweater that suited her perfectly, along with white corduroy pants that complemented her smooth, graceful figure. A pair of red, elf-style boots completed the outfit. She looked unlike any teacher I had ever seen before or, now that I think about it, any teacher I have seen since. As I blinked at her, my imagination briefly ran ahead of me, forming an uninvited picture that I quickly dismissed. I decided, somewhat sheepishly, that she would probably look quite nice. Just as quickly, I dropped my gaze to her feet. I had no desire to be called out for staring again. All right, she said at last. "Find a chair, sit down, and be quiet." I quickly took the first available seat in the front row. There were only two other students sitting there, a slender girl in a bright yellow sundress to my left, and what appeared to be her identically dressed twin sister to my right. I gave the girl on my right a brief, casual glance before turning my attention elsewhere. Putting them out of my mind, I gathered my English textbook, notebook, and a pen. When I looked up again, the teacher was already writing on the board. After school let out for the day, I made my way to the front of the building, where a long line of yellow school buses waited in the wide circular driveway. I walked slowly along the row, scanning each bus and its driver, searching for the one who had picked up our group that morning while we waited beside the arena. When I spotted her, I started walking toward the steps of the bus. "You have to wait for the late bus," she said, not unkindly. "Oh, why is that?" I asked politely. "Because you were picked up this morning at the late bus stop by the arena," she replied. It was obvious that I had no idea what she was talking about. That day had been the very first time I had ever ridden a school bus, and I knew nothing about early or late buses. "How long do I have to wait?" I asked. 45 minutes. "I'll be back to pick you and the others up," she said. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly 3:45, which meant I would have to wait around the school until 4:30 before I could finally catch the bus home. As I walked back toward the picnic table, my thoughts returned to my brief encounter with the girl who had refused to tell me her name. I sat down on the edge of the table and took a quiet moment to myself. Gazing across the parking lot toward the small hill where some of the older students were gathered, my mind began to drift. The day had been overwhelming, filled with sights, sounds, and fleeting impressions that seemed to blur together. Try as I might, I realized I could recall only fragments of everything I had seen and heard. Suddenly, the mystery girl was sitting right beside me. "Hiya, cutie," she said brightly. I'm sure I jumped a little at her sudden appearance, but I managed to pull myself together quickly. "Boo," she added with a grin, lighting up a cigarette of her own as she smiled at me. "Hi," I replied brightly. I didn't want her to think she had succeeded in startling me. We both knew she had, of course, but she seemed content to let it pass without comment. She took a long pull from her cigarette and then released the smoke slowly, her lips forming a neat little circle as it drifted into the air. We sat side by side until we had finished our cigarettes. She flicked hers away into the parking lot, while I carefully ground mine out against the pavement. I glanced at my watch, checking the time. I didn't want to miss my bus. "How much time before your bus?" she asked. "About half an hour, I think." "Half an hour, huh?" She smiled again, and there was no mistaking the mischief in her eyes. "Do you want to go back to the shed with me?" She was already heading in that direction. Sure, I guess," I replied, trying to sound as though I was still concerned about the bus. "Just for a little while, though, don't worry," she said confidently. "You won't miss it." There was such certainty in her voice that I stopped worrying altogether. Missing the bus would have been disastrous. There was no other way home short of calling my mom to come and get me, and I would never have heard the end of it. Still, her voice carried a calm confidence that put me at ease. Before long, we were back at the shed. Somehow it felt darker inside than it had before. I was fairly sure it wasn't, but at the time it certainly seemed that way. We sat on the old bench facing each other, just as we had earlier. She tilted her head slightly and asked with a playful smile, "Would you like to keep talking about what we were discussing before?" I smiled back at her. "You know I would," I replied, trying to sound relaxed. Her eyes focused on mine. "Then say it." I hesitated for only a moment before answering, "Pretty please. Could we continue where we left off?" She leaned over quickly, and we began what was only my second kiss with a woman who wasn't a relative. In the flurry of movement and nervous excitement, her jersey and bra were removed and placed behind her on the bench. Everything felt rushed and unreal, as though the moment itself was carrying us forward before I had time to fully understand what was happening. This time, I wasn't caught off guard by her actions, which gave me a moment to consider what to do next. I placed my hands lightly at her sides, just above her waist. Slowly opening my palms, I guided them upward and then settled them across her back. After a moment, my hands began to move in unhurried paths, rising and falling across the smooth skin there. My fingers traced easy, wandering patterns while my palms followed, smoothing and calming as they went, as though committing every motion to memory. She visibly trembled when my hands slid upward along either side of her spine, my fingers tracing a gentle path before slowly drifting back down again. As they moved, my palms followed close behind, easing their way along her back in a slow, unhurried rhythm, as if trying to soothe every bit of tension they encountered. She let out a quiet, involuntary sound and asked with a playful hint in her voice, "Did you learn that from a book too?" I smiled and answered simply, "The very same one."